Well, let's take a look at this now. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky believes Russia is using gas to intimidate European countries. Zelensky alleges that Russia is modifying its supplies and costs to impose what he terms a price terror against Europe. Earlier this week, the Russian energy company Gazprom announced plans to reduce gas flows through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline to Germany. The company cited equipment repairs. However, the announcement sparked fears that Russia may continuously use gas as political leverage due to sanctions imposed against Moscow over the Ukraine war.
Зокрема, сьогоднішні повідомлення про чергове спровоковане зростання газових цін на європейській біржі вище $2000 за 1000 кубів – це вже достатній привід, щоб розширити санкції проти Росії. Оскільки для всіх зрозуміло, що це свідомий ціновий терор Росії проти Європи. Використовуючи «Газпром», Москва робить все, щоб ця зима стала для європейських країн найбільш жорсткою. На терор потрібно відповідати санкціям.
Meanwhile, Russia appears to be keeping to the deal it signed with Ukraine, allowing it to resume exporting grain. This may provide much-needed relief to importing countries, including many on our continent. Well, let's have a conversation now with the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa Chief Economist Wandile Sihlobo. Wandile, good evening to you, and thanks very much indeed for your time. We know that this conflict's had a huge impact on our food prices in so many different ways. The release of this grain, which as I understand it is in the port of Odessa, how significant is that?
It's quite significant, Stephen, because we are looking at roughly 22 million tons of grain. That's largely wheat, sunflower, barley, and the other small grains. So if you were to be released in the world market, I think it would also come in an environment where global prices are starting to come off from the levels that we had seen right months after the invasion. For example, if you were to look at the global food price index by the FAO, it's already down by 2% on a month-on-month, and we've been seeing that trend of a decline on prices or softening of prices for the past 3 months. So a release of additional supply would really bode well for that movement on prices.
There's several dynamics to this. I mean, you've got this grain, you've got, I think the United Nations suggested there are around 44 million people who are dependent on it. Is that number right? It's a very large number of people who suddenly suffer because of a war in Europe.
It is quite a large number, Stephen, but I think, yes, the war in Europe is the major topic on the point, but there's a number of underpinning factors that are adding to that. Let's look, Stephen, for a moment in our own continent, in Africa. If you think about the folks in the eastern part of the continent, there's been minor wars that are happening there in parts of Ethiopia and the others, disrupting smallholder farming. In addition to that, we've had crop diseases such as pest infestation in that eastern region, Africa region apart, and also droughts. All of those had already undermined the domestic food production or agriculture for smallholder farming. So the war in Europe impacting negatively on global supplies and leading to higher global prices, it reaches that environment that is already vulnerable. And of course, I will close off and saying we should never underestimate the drought that has been there in South America, as well as a rising demand in China, which have all added into this rise in prices and exacerbated by the war.
We're obviously part of the international sort of food chain, international prices. We take those prices no matter what they are. Do you think then that over the next month we're actually going to see food prices, maybe not coming down, but food price inflation slowing? In other words, the pressure on food prices to go up will stop.
I think, Stephen, we have to look into this in two ways. The first one being that there's still risks as to whether there will really be a success on moving that grain out of Ukraine. Because we know that the deal was signed last Friday, but Saturday morning we woke up to the news of other missiles hitting some vessels within the ports of Odessa. So that on its own raises the uncertainty about really what's the possibility or practical measures of actually getting that grain out. But let's assume for a moment that it was going to be a success, that grain would come out. I think it would add then to that softening on prices. And secondly, in South Africa, regardless of what happens in the grain market, we expect food price inflation in general to begin softening in the greater part of the second half of the year, underpinned by softening of prices in fruit, vegetable, and to an extent in meat. So the decline in grain prices would be an added factor to that if it does indeed come out of the port of Odessa.
The other question, of course, is what happens in Ukraine in the longer term. It is a massive exporter of food. We are talking about food that's already been grown that will now be exported. We don't quite know yet what's going to happen next season. I mean, I presume that their planting for next season, probably already underway, is not going to be what it was.
Absolutely. All of the estimates that we are seeing, Stephen, they're looking at about 40-50% decline in some of the other crops. We yet to see what the final harvest of some of the new crops will look like. But the point is they need to get this grain that they have out of the country for now, because there's also quality issues if you keep this grain stored in there for quite a while. But for long term then, of course, we'll have to be thinking about whether Ukraine will continue to play a major role, and also what other countries in the world will be doing in boosting their agriculture. Because I think the war is also a wake-up call to say we have a strong dependence on certain countries, but where there's capacity to expand, what can those nations do so that we have a nicely well-distributed production, at least of major staples across the world.
Wandile, Sihlobo, thanks very much indeed, Chief Economist at the Agriculture Business Chamber.